I got to tell you, about a month ago, I had the worst stand-up gig in history. I was the warm-up guy for Jerry Seinfeld.
You're kidding?
No.
Why didn't you tell me about that?
Bill, it was at a synagogue, as a synagogue fundraiser, and they got Jerry Seinfeld, but he only agreed to do half an hour. So they had to fill out the hour, and they asked me to do it, and I'm not even a stand-up comedian. So it was like everyone is looking at their watches and like, when is Jerry? Who the hell is this guy? Let's get Jerry on.
Imagine two lives as like, let's say, a sequence of events. Usually you can staple some of those events together, like, oh, that happened to me too, or that happened to me too. In almost any life, like you could kind of say, oh, we've been through some things that are a little bit similar. But with someone like Biz Markie, we had no area to staple our lives together. And not only that, then I further exacerbated the problem by saying, just a friend. How does it feel like that? Just a friend was the main thing people know you by, and that's the song he did in the 80s. So 35 years ago or whatever, or 25 years or 28 years ago. And he's like, no, I've had many hits since Just a Friend. And I'm like, yeah, but when I go to your website, it just plays Just a Friend as soon as I hit your website. And if you go to anybody in China, they know Just a Friend and none of your other songs. And he's like, no, I had this, I had that, I'm a Nickelodeon. And I said, I know all that. And he basically just hung up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jason Gaynard here. Welcome to this Wildcard Wednesday episode of the Community Made podcast. Now, if you are a loyal listener of the podcast, you're probably like, Jason, your audio quality is on point. And if that's the case, I have one man to thank for that, my buddy Mark at Cosmo Music. A few weeks ago, I was re-listening to all the episodes from season 1, and I was not happy with the audio quality of my solo episodes specifically. And oddly enough, those are the episodes I invest the most amount of time and energy on. And I ended up posting to Facebook, asking friends of mine in the podcasting space what is their favorite equipment, because I was very naive. I had just a microphone plugged right into my laptop, and any audiophile will tell you that is a big no-no, which I simply did not know at the time. And had a lot of friends kind of comment on that thread, and then ultimately went to go visit my friend Mark, who owns Cosmo Music. Cosmo Music is the largest, I think it's the largest music superstore in the world, at least in North America. They're 56,000 square feet. And when I showed up to his superstore, he had every single product that was recommended in that Facebook post, and there's probably 50 or 60 comments. He had it laid out on the table, and we walked through it all, and I wanted a system that would produce great audio quality, but wouldn't be complex or complicated in any sense. And I'm looking at it right now. I have some kind of flashing light and a few dials that I don't know what they do, but I think my audio is coming through fine. So thank you, Mark. With that said, let's get into this episode. Now, you're probably like, what is this so-called Wildcard Wednesday? Well, you probably know that Community Made is released in seasons, and every season is themed. So season 1 was all about scale and questioning your goals. Season 2, which I'm working on right now as we speak, is all about how to grow, how to nurture, and how to amplify your business relationships. Season 3 is also going to be about creating raving fans, and I don't want to let you in on season 4. I don't want you to get too excited, but every season is themed ultimately. And my belief is that some of the best conversations or interviews are when things just kind of unfold organically and you just see where the conversation takes you. With that said, sometimes those said conversations won't fit into an upcoming theme. And in this case, the conversation I'm about to share with you was far too good to just let it slip by the wayside. I mean, I re-listened to this episode a few days ago. I've re-listened to it twice in the last week, actually, and I was just in stitches. This interview was a blast to record. In it, I feature two very good friends of mine, James Altucher and A.J. Jacobs. Both of these men are unique, to say the least. James is the host of the wildly popular James Altucher podcast. He's a former hedge fund manager who lost millions of dollars of his net worth month over month for many months a few years ago until he hit rock bottom ultimately. And he's known for his especially in his writing, but podcasting as well. He's known for his transparency and his vulnerability. His blog has had over 20 million views to date, and his podcast over 30 million downloads. He's a prolific writer with over 18 books under his belt, including 40 Alternatives to College, which is actually the book that I first read of his that got him on my radar, How to Be the Luckiest Person Alive, and Choose Yourself, which has sold hundreds of thousands of copies being self-published. He's probably the most eccentric guy I know, and to prove it, the New York Times wrote an article on him called Why Self-Help Guru James Altucher Only Owns 15 Things, and I can vouch that that is true. He's been a nomad for quite some time, just Airbnb-ing for the last couple years. Very, very interesting character. AJ is another interesting man. With that said, he's an editor at Esquire magazine and has written 4 New York Times bestselling books, which every single one of these books just being unconventional to say the least. He actually just released a new book, which I'm not sure if it hit New York Times yet or not. I'll have to double check that. But in 2005, AJ released The Know-It-All, One Man's Humble Quest to Become the Smartest Person in the World, where he read the Encyclopedia Britannica from A to Z, which is over 33,000 pages, 44 million words, and basically documented all of that experience in that book. In 2008, he released The Year of Living Biblically, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Bible as literally as possible. And that book was really an exploration of just like the religion and the Bible, and AJ basically chronicled through his hilarious way of writing and his hilarious way of living, obeying basically everything he could when it came to, the rules and the tenets of the Bible. In 2012, he released My Life as an Experiment, One Man's Humble Quest. He's a very humble man. One man's humble quest to improve himself by living as a woman, becoming George Washington, telling no lies, and other radical tests. In that book, he went undercover as a woman, again, lived by George Washington's moral code. He impersonated a movie star and practiced one of the most, I think, interesting part of the books is where he practices radical honesty. And actually, that book, which was when? I think it was 2008? 2010, there was a part in there where he outsourced every part of his life to India, and Tim Ferriss actually leveraged that article and put it in the 4-Hour Workweek when it actually released in 2007. The original article that AJ wrote was, I think, a few years before Tim came out with his book, and so I know AJ was a huge inspiration for Tim. Funny side note, when Tim was coming out with the 4-Hour Workweek, I think it was a couple months before he published, he asked AJ if he could showcase that article in his book. And AJ's like, yeah, sure, like not a big deal, not thinking anything of it, didn't think anything would come from the 4-Hour Workweek, that it would just be like most books. And then I think a week after the book launched, Tim reached out to AJ again. He's like, oh my God, he's like, my book's a New York Times bestseller. And AJ was just blown away. And looking back in hindsight, 4-Hour Workweek has now been one of the most successful books in the last 10 years, especially in the nonfiction space. So little side note there. And one of his most recent books, his second last book, which is again another fascinating one, Drop Dead Healthy, One Man's Humble Quest for Bodily Perfection. In this episode, we talk about the art of the interview, how to build rapport with almost everyone, including celebrities, why famous rapper Biz Markie hung up on James Altucher, and why AJ and James are not only distant cousins, but they discover live on the recording that they are both opened up for the great Jerry Seinfeld. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this intimate conversation with James Altucher and AJ Jacobs. Well, we should do some vocal warm-ups. Do you have any vocal warm-ups you use?
That's a good question. No,
all three of us have very interesting voices for radio, so
that's true. Well, you could do rutabaga and asparagus. That's what you're supposed to say.
Just chant that over and over.
Yeah, when you're in the background of TV shows, I think, isn't that what
rutabaga and asparagus? I never heard that.
Or peas and carrots, but I prefer rutabaga and asparagus.
Well, you were just on set recently.
That's true.
We will talk about that. Actually, are we ready to roll now, or?
I'm actually rolling right now, so.
That is beautiful. We got all kinds of B-roll already. This is great. Awesome. Well, I actually haven't given you guys much context outside of the email I shot yesterday. So we really appreciate you guys doing this.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
So we did talk about a little bit, potentially offline, I don't know if it was recorded or not, that I had a podcast before, and I am in the process of relaunching it. but this time I'm batching some episodes because before it would come out every Thursday, and I'd wake up on Thursday morning. I'm like, crap, I got to come up with an episode today. So a lot of them were like solo episodes and those kind of things. But I did
Solo episodes are hard because people don't always want to listen to the same voice for an hour.
Yeah, I mean, the solo episodes I did, and the reason I went solo, and this helps kind of paint context for, I guess, this style of interview, is I interviewed. So originally I was doing interviews, and I ended up interviewing Seth Godin. And Seth, I mean, on some level, consciously or unconsciously, I put him on a little bit of a pedestal. And when I was doing an interview with him, I was asking him questions, and while he was responding, I wasn't present to his answers. I was thinking of the next question. And I was like, there's so many great interviewers like that out there. James is one of them. Andrew Warner is another great one. You know, Tim Ferriss is really getting, great momentum now. He's a fantastic interviewer. I'm like, there's so many great interviewers out there. I'm not going to really, it'll take a while for me to get to their level. And I need to be able to get comfortable. So I decided on this format, which is basically sit down with two friends and organically kind of chat for,
To be honest, I think I'm tired of the typical interview show. I think kind of the best shows I do are like, let's say with A.J. over here, where it's just the rapport of friends talking, and we're, we're all working on interesting things, so we get to talk about that, and it's not like the standard, oh, how did you achieve such greatness? And then they tell us, and then I ask, well, then what did you do? And sometimes interviews are a little boring. We've all listened to thousands of interviews already. It's better to just hear kind of organic conversations.
Yeah, no, and I've done probably about 10 thus far. And it's all people who have very kind of strong rapport with. And it's been absolutely amazing. I mean, just time flies.
Yeah.
I'm going to be very respectful of your time, because especially I know you have some writing, you have some podcast interviews coming up later today. But yeah, they've turned out to be just my favorite interviews to do. And I enjoy them immensely. So with that said, again, very grateful to have you both on. For context, should anybody need to be brought up to speed, to my left is Mr. James Altucher. I actually had to write down all of both your books and your books because you guys are such prolific writers. So James and I met, actually one commonality they both share is you guys supported us at the first Mastermind Talks event, which I will never forget.
We all met on the same day, actually.
That's true.
Actually, it's true, but I met AJ a year prior.
Oh, that was amazing.
We bought AJ's time.
Yeah, I was in a charity auction, and Candace and Jason bought me for, I don't know, $100 or something. But now it's beautiful.
You were that cheap, AJ?
I know, I'm cheap. Listen, but
I
now
pay at least $1,000 for your time.
Well, thank you. I'm giving it pro bono today. But Jason, now I was thinking like people would pay you. Now you can go up on charity
I don't know
auction.
if I go that far. But,
absolutely.
It was, Candace she's read all your books. And I think she read the year, she just finished reading Year Living Biblically or something like that. And I knew you're like one of her favorite authors, if not, her favorite author. And we talked about you being in our top 5. But yeah, then I saw this charity auction came up, and truth be told, it wasn't a Charity Buzz, which was the platform at the time, is much bigger now. It didn't get like a lot of traction, so you were a hell of a bargain, I will say. But I paid triple that. But yeah, we met up with AJ and just absolutely hit it off. He was fantastic. And then when Mastermind Talks started to come to fruition, it happened really quickly. I didn't know too many speakers.
Well, that was a brilliant way that you pulled it off. I mean, having never done an event, and then being able to get a lot of speakers who are, I'm not saying I'm a big name, but you got Altucher, you got Tim Ferriss.
You got AJ, you got Mark Echo that first time.
Mm-hmm. So how did you do that? How did you get people to agree?
So I had a kind of weak tie relationship with most people. I mean, I didn't know James specifically, but I met you once, and we somewhat stayed in touch and that kind of stuff. So when I started Mastermind Talks, I didn't have a network or really a strong peer group at the time. But what happened was when I got Tim, and I don't know if you guys remember how I got Tim. I bought his 4,000 copies of 4-Hour Chef, which I still have 3,500 copies. So if anybody ever needs free copies of the 4-Hour Chef, they cost more to ship than what they're worth really at this point. But when I had Tim, I kind of used him as almost like in real estate, there's a term called anchor tenant. And
Right.
if you have a flailing mall or something, if you plug in a Nordstrom, it's going to attract other great brands as well. So having Tim as that anchor, I could get people who want to be connected to Tim to speak, or people who are already connected with Tim but are never at the same place at the same time. And I know, for example, you and Tim had a long relationship going back when he came out with a 4-Hour Work Week.
Right.
And that was, from what I understand, like the first time you guys met in like kind of several years.
Yeah.
Was at the event. So that was kind of the I guess that was
That's a brilliant strategy. And then you had the additional strategy of you had us all competing with each other to see who, like, you know, a $30,000 speaker prize.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you had to, in the speech, from what I remember, you had to offer $100,000 in value was the idea in your speech. It was like a 15-minute talk. And then the audience would vote who offered the $100,000 in value. And I really wanted to win. And so I was consulting professors on what would be the right cognitive biases to trigger to try to get the audience to be a little bit, you know, because there was like 13 speakers. So you only needed a few extra votes to
I voted
win.
for you.
Well, I appreciate that.
I would, but the guy who won, was it Joey Coleman?
Joey Coleman. He actually did offer specific value that was worth $100,000.
Well, his strategy, as I remember, was he got a photo of everyone in the audience and then said their name, which is all you have to do.
Huge cognitive bias, the name bias.
That's like this publisher of a small newspaper. I read his strategy is just to print the names of the people who live in the town as often as possible.
Yeah.
And that really is like just, yeah.
Was it you who did that? There was an article on that where I've heard about that. I don't know if it was through you, but it was like it's a very small community, but they sell more papers than there are people in the community, even though it's very targeted. And it's because they put like everybody's name in the
That's
publication.
actually my strategy in my new book is I'm going to have like a 400-page acknowledgments and just list, because it's about family and how everyone's family. So I just list everyone I've ever met. And
so if you sell one book per acknowledgement, boom, New York Times bestseller right
that's
there.
the idea.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great. Yeah, no, we did that competition for the first couple years. And the beautiful thing is that every year the big name speakers that we brought in generally weren't in the top 5. You guys were in the top 5 year one.
I don't know if that's true.
But
I don't think I was, actually.
You were. I think. Well, Candace is shaking her head. She says you were.
Thanks, Candace.
Mind you, though, I think we had 4 people tied for 3rd. So that would put you. You were definitely in top 5. But that was
a
great.
good way to do it. If everyone is tied, everyone's in the top.
We were all tied. The rest of us were tied for 4th.
Yeah.
No, and I remember. Yeah, James's talk was. I remember James coming up to me. You were so nervous, and that was the one thing I put all these speakers on a pedestal. Like they're so cool and confident and all that kind of stuff. And then James came up to me on break right before like you were speaking like next or something like that, and I remember him being just so nervous, and he's like, do you mind if I just go up there and do a Q&A? And I'm like, you do whatever you want to do. And then he went up there, and it was amazing. I mean, you had people in stitches. So, because you're like, sometimes it's better, something about like entrepreneurship, and you just want to like lay in a meadow or something like that. And how difficult entrepreneurship is. So.
Well, I also remember I got an actual good tip out of James, because James told me once that you listen to like Louis C.K. right before you go up, or someone, which is brilliant because it just puts you in a good mood, and
And then also you start to, you have these like mirror neurons that trigger. So you automatically it's like you get this injection of Louis C.K. into your brain. And so you start to mimic his movements and the way he inflects his voice, and not necessarily the jokes, but just his way about him. He's like essentially he's the best public speaker in the world.
Right.
Because he gets people to laugh and enjoy him and so on. So you get that little boost.
Oh, and I actually recently did a piece with Jim Gaffigan, the comedian.
Yeah.
And the idea was, it was for NPR. I found the oldest jokes in the world, like from 2500 BC Babylon, and had him tell them at a comedy club. And his delivery was so good that they worked. They kill like from 2500 BC Sumeria, he can make them work. And it's because his voice he has so much variation in his voice. Like it goes high and to low, and he mixes it up so much. It's the exact opposite of monotone, whatever that is, multitone.
Yeah.
So that that was a very good lesson. For
I
me.
think delivery might be 70 or 80% of joke telling for those guys, for stand-up. Not necessarily for monologues like Jay Leno or David Letterman or those guys, but for like stand-up, I think it's a big part of it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we definitely can't skim over the fact that you just did your third stand. And I will say I have one thing that I'm absolutely terrified of doing. It is on my bucket list, is to actually try stand-up. I took a course and I went to one class. And
you were too scared to go to class.
Terrified, absolutely terrified.
Well, it's funny because we all do public speaking, right? And I always get nervous a little bit with public speaking, as you just mentioned, but stand-up's just a different beast because you're not going up there to talk about like a topic. You're going up there with no reason at all.
Right.
Like you're just going up there. They don't have any idea who you are, and they're primed to just laugh. So you have to make them laugh, and it's hard. And it's scary.
Well, I can imagine, because when you say, like, hey, I've got a really funny joke, and then you tell a joke, it never works. So, but stand-up is basically that. You're like, hey, I'm going to be funny. That's why whenever I write, I don't like being classed in the humor section, even though I usually am. But I'd much rather be in, like, something serious, like reference books. And then they pick it up, and they're like, oh, this is a nice surprise. But if you start something with like, this is the greatest story ever,
you set that expectation, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing with public speaking, like let's say you give a talk, let's say you're giving a talk about, I don't know, entrepreneurship. You're allowed to tell stories, and then every minute or so, if you have if you have something that's funny, then people laugh because they're not expecting it. But that's every minute or two, and then suddenly you're the funniest public speaker. But if you're doing stand-up, if you time, like let's say a Louis C.K., there's laughter every 5 to 10 seconds.
Wow.
Even when he's telling a story, it's 5 to 10 seconds. Every 5 to 10 seconds, there's laughter for an hour. And so that's like impossible to do when you're giving like a normal talk.
Right.
And so you might be like the funniest public speaker, but it's totally different beast than making someone laugh every 10 seconds.
What was your, again, like knowing when I met you in 2013, when you were speaking at Mastermind Talks, and was very nervous in that setting. And I'm incredibly nervous when I speak as well. But to speak on a stage as a comedian of sorts, I mean, that is absolutely terrifying to me. So, like, how did you just decide this Friday I'm going to do a stand-up gig, or is that something you planned for a while? Did you use a coach, or you just jumped right into it?
No, the owner of the club knew me he had a podcast studio, so he knew me from some podcasts I had done there, and he had read my stuff. So he said, why don't you, if you ever have 5 minutes of material, just give us a call. And that, of course, is a challenge to me. So I said, okay, put me on next week. I just said it just like that. I had no material. And that gave me just a challenge to just do it. And then once I did it, I said, okay, put me on the week after. And so I did it twice in a row, and I'll do it again. But, once you give me the challenge, I'm doing it.
Now, you've been a huge fan of stand-up comedy for a very long time. Have you looked into, and have you really kind of dug into like the structure of jokes and that kind of stuff? Or just,
Yeah. So, but the thing is, none of that helps. The only thing that really helps, like when I interview on my podcast stand-up comedians, the one thing that the best comedians have in common is basically minimum of 12 years of almost everyday experience. So you're just not going to get really good unless you're up there a lot on the stage. So I'm never going to get that good. I just want to get a little better. But, the best ones are just, like take a Jim Gaffigan. He's probably, from beginning to now, he probably has been on like 10,000 times on stage. So, or Louis C.K. would go on like 3 or 4 times a night. Like now comedians, there's like 5 clubs in New York. They'll go on like 4 times a night, 7 nights a week to get better.
Yeah.
I had no clue of that until I started listening to some podcasts with comedians and, big name comedians that do big theater shows, big like auditoriums. Just hearing them, they're doing like these open mics at these small little bars. And I'm like, you're one of the best in the world, and you're still going 3-4 times a week.
Well, I'll tell you, the first time I went on, right after I went on, you know who showed up at the club? Jerry Seinfeld.
Really?
And he went on.
So I got to tell you, about a month ago, I had the worst stand-up gig in history. I was warming up. I was the warm-up guy for Jerry Seinfeld.
You're kidding.
No.
Why didn't you tell me about that?
Well, it was at a synagogue as a synagogue fundraiser, and they got Jerry Seinfeld, but he only agreed to do half an hour, so they had to fill out the hour. And they asked me to do it, and I'm not even a stand-up comedian. So it was like everyone is looking at their watches and like, when is Jerry? Who the hell is this guy? Let's get Jerry on. It was the most stress. But you know what?
But I've seen you go up on a stand-up venue, and you're good. You have a fun
nice
time.
To say. I mean, it was so ridiculous that it was freeing, because it was like, I think in that case you have to lean into it and be like, hey, I'm not Jerry Seinfeld. I know that you guys just want me the hell off the stage. And that loosened everyone up, because they're like, oh, yeah, we're all on the same page. we don't know who you are. You know you don't want to be here. So
what did you do? Like, did you go do like kind of set up punchline type jokes, or did you tell your stories, which were funny?
I told about my book. So I told about my year of living biblically, and then someone else came up and sang a song, and then I got up again, and I had to go up again, and I'm like, hey, I'm still not Jerry Seinfeld. And everyone's like, yeah, you're still not Jerry Seinfeld. And then I told about my new book, and then Jerry came out.
So was the expectation for you actually to do jokes, or was it just for you to kind of open up for Jerry and just share about your books?
Well, I had to do about half an hour material, but it was all about my books.
Because your talks are funny to begin with.
Yeah.
Right, that's, I think, what they figured.
Yeah.
Like, it was sort of a mixture of funny. But it was also funny because Jerry Seinfeld, he specifically said he is not going to talk to anyone at the venue. He showed up literally like 30 seconds before his set. He said, I don't know how he knew my name. He's like, thanks, A.J., great job, even though he saw 0 seconds. And then he literally was gone the second that he said, thank you. He was out the door. He did not interact with a single person. So,
and he lives right near there, right? Like,
yeah. He said it was the best gig of his life because it was a block away from his house.
Yeah.
And he said that he was going to be in bed before the room cleared.
How was his set? Good?
Well, yeah. I mean, he is unbelievable.
I've never seen him live. I've heard he's absolutely amazing, though.
Oh, yeah, he's very good.
So you both, not only you both cousins, distant cousins, but you've both opened for Jerry Seinfeld.
That is weird.
More or less.
And what was your experience like?
Well, I've seen him live in doing a whole hour and at the Beacon Theater. And he's very good because he uses his whole body. He's, inflecting his voice constantly, like he's using different voices all the time. And he's very physical, so he's all over the stage. And his jokes are not, he doesn't necessarily always come up with new material. So some jokes I recognized, even from the show, from the TV show, I recognize some of the jokes. But he just does a great job. He's such a classic.
Well, he also, I think, one great skill is that it sounds like it's all impromptu and extemporaneous. And people who were there said he just did the exact same thing he did at the Beacon. But he makes it sound like he's like those comedians who purposely make a mistake and be like, oh, we're learning together. I just saw a comedian do that line, even though I know he's done it 500 times before.
I went to Madison Square Garden to see Louis C.K. a few months ago, and it's now the basis of his just released special, and he made a mistake. It almost seemed like a glaring mistake in his thing, but then he went off on a tangent and told a whole joke about, speaking of, because of his mistake, and then you figure afterwards, oh, he must have totally planned that, and then because it was so funny what the tangent that he went off of, it was almost the funniest part of his stand-up, and so when they make mistakes, it's totally planned.
Although I do have a friend who does a lot of public speaking who says he hopes and sometimes plans for a technical error early on in the talk, like that the PowerPoint will jam, because he feels that it bonds the speaker with the audience. Like you're all in this disaster together. And that it makes it more informal, breaks down the wall. So that it'd be interesting if I might try that. Just
bomb right out of the gate.
Right out of the gate.
What? So Louis C.K. I know is somebody who you've wanted to interview. I guess for quite some time.
I've had 2 people on my bucket list for podcast interviews. Other than you guys, of course. AJ's been on my podcast.
I
like
didn't
5
realize
times.
you interviewed AJ back in like February or something like that. I was going through your website this morning. I'm like, you guys were already in front of each other like 2 months ago.
AJ, I've interviewed you like 4 or 5 times. You've been on my podcast.
I love it.
So, but Gary Kasparov, the former world chess champion, has been on my bucket list, and I just interviewed him.
Yeah,
so that one's going to air in May. And then Louis C.K. is on my bucket list.
How has so over how long have you had your podcast for? 3 years?
Yeah, since I started putting together episodes in December 2013.
Yeah, and February is when you launched.
I think
Roughly.
January was when I launched.
Because I remember, because that's when I had my podcast at the time. How is like you? What do you look for in guests? Because I mean, it seems like when anybody starts a podcast, anybody with a heartbeat, they'll have on some level. But it seems like now you're obviously, after doing 200 plus episodes on this podcast, plus you've done several others. Is there something you look for specifically in a guest?
Yeah, I think I look for 2 things. One is peak performance, so they've achieved peak performance in some area of life. And whatever that means, it can mean different things in different areas, and some sort of reinvention. So they had a hard time at first, and then they went through it, and they tell us how they got through it, and then they achieve their peak performance. So I tend to look for that pattern.
And has it gotten significantly easier for you as far as the outreach? Because you're getting some really kind of great names, especially as of late. Some people who I would say are almost, unattainable for most to get an hour of their time.
It does get easier for 2 reasons. One is you build up a relationship with lots of publicists and the PR firms of publishers and television companies and so on. So you build relationships with the people who are trying to promote their people, and that takes time to build up that network. And also you just over time you get more traffic and you have more guests that people could say, oh, he had on these 3 people who are similar, so this must be good for me too. So you build up that kind of I don't know what you call it, but that kind of brand.
Is there a story of how you got a particular guest, like you sent them marzipan or something that they didn't
I mean, every guest has been kind of difficult in the long run. I mean, some of the best guests I've had on, like Gary Kasparov, for instance, took 2 years to get on. And so finally I figured out how to get him on. I was talking to his publisher about one of my books, and his publisher hooked me up with him and got him on. But there's nothing been too crazy. Although now I'm trying something where I'll donate to their charity to get them on. So I'm not paying them, but I'll take the profits from the podcast and I'll throw that towards their charity.
Smart.
So I'll get them on.
But, I mean, I remember hearing you talk about trying to get certain guests, and people have this big misconception that, once you get a certain size, like all these guests are kind of knocking on your door. But it's a lot of work.
Yeah, even, look, I've had on the producer of the Jay Leno Show when the Jay Leno Show was on, and he was telling me it would take them years to get on guests. So it's never easy to get on a guest. If a guest has no reason to go on, they don't go on anything. So they have to have some reason. You have to give people a why they should go on your show. And if there's no why that will entice them, then they're just not going on any show. So,
well, one thing I want to definitely ask both of you, because both of you have quite a bit of experience when it comes to this, is preparing for interviews. I think there's a couple of different schools of thought. There's going into an interview almost blind, and then there's almost over preparing on the other side of things. And after seeing you do a couple of interviews for us for Mastermind Talks with Tony Hawk and Rick Ross, and just knowing you over the years, you historically prep a ton, more than anybody else I know. At least that was the case back in the day. Is that still the case now? And is that something you do for every guest? Do you try to really prepare and know? Because I've seen you read like multiple books before you have a guest on, or watch your documentaries, or dig to the depths of the web to find out unique things.
Well, I've been switching a little lately, but AJ, how about you go first on this?
I am in the over preparing. I love, because I think you can find a random quote that someone gave like 7 years ago that they've never talked about again, and just dive deep on that. One of the best interviews I ever did was for Esquire. I did an interview with George Clooney, and the idea was, he didn't, at the time, it's like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. He didn't go on the internet a lot. So the idea was that I went and found all of this crap about George Clooney on the internet, like some of the worst stuff. And then I just showed it to him and got his reaction. And it was awesome because
That's brilliant. So, but that's not just over preparing. That's a format.
That's true. It is a
too.
format. But it's also like I spent hours looking at like there was a website that said George Clooney is gay, gay, gay. That was the name of the website. And he said, he's like, that is not true. I'm gay, gay, but that third gay is pushing it. So he was like very into it. And there's websites about celebrities' heights. They'll debate the heights for like pages.
How tall is George Clooney?
George Clooney is 5'11" and a half. I remember that. And then there's...
I'd love to know how much mental real estate that's taking in your brain.
Right, you've remembered that for
80%.
10 years. 5'11" and a half.
That's right. But yeah, so I find that to be fun. I did an interview recently. The other thing about is nowadays people have done a lot of podcasts, and if they're starting out, they'll do... I interviewed this one woman, Sashir Zameda from Saturday Night Live, and she had done early in her career, before she was on Saturday Night Live, a podcast called Poop Talk. And it was literally an hour about bowel movements and like your rituals. And I was like, I cannot believe that A, this podcast exists. I don't know if it still does. And B, that she did it. And I brought it up and she was so embarrassed. It was super awkward. But it actually sometimes...
But it's such a funny idea for a podcast. Like, is that what got her on Saturday Night Live? Because they like listened to that and she was probably funny on it?
Maybe, but I have a feeling not, because the publicist was like, you could tell that she had been told not to bring up the poop talk.
They've been trying to bury that.
That was something the publicist was like, all right, when you go on, don't mention the poop talk.
So how long is there an average time you'd spend interviewing a guest? I guess or interviewing somebody for Esquire or even for your books. I guess it's all contextual, but
yeah, the longer the better. I find. I mean, it depends on the format, but certainly for Esquire, the longer the better, because also you want time not only to talk to them, but you've got to have time to open up yourself, because that's the way I find you get people to open up, is you tell embarrassing stories about yourself, and then they're like, oh, well, I can tell an embarrassing story about me. Now, this isn't when you're doing in a magazine, like you don't print your own embarrassing stories. So
just theirs.
Just theirs. But then in a podcast you do. I remember I interviewed Scarlett Johansson once for Esquire, and she did a great thing. Is she was like, why, I was asking her a seriously personal question, and she was like, those are so personal. I'm like, well, ask me. I don't mind. Ask me. And so she like grabbed my notebook and was like, when did you lose your virginity? What did, have you ever had a STD? And I like answered, and we did print those answers in the magazine. I felt it was only fair. But I do like that when they flip the script on you.
I think it probably also builds, like, if you know nuggets about them that nobody else has brought up, it probably helps to build rapport with them really quickly, because they're like, oh, this person's really like doing their due diligence, or they're really digging in. This is different.
Right. I totally agree.
I think they totally appreciate, like, I remember one time I had on Adam Grant, who wrote Give and Take, and he just has come out, or he's coming out with a book with Sheryl Sandberg. And I remember I'm asking questions about almost every page of the book, but in particular, I asked him, I was curious about something in the acknowledgments at the end. And so he was very, like, he even noticed, oh, you even are asking me about the acknowledgments, because I was curious why he had, thanked a particular person.
So what your approach, you said, has changed over the last little bit? Because I know, like, on the opposite side of the spectrum, I believe it's like Larry King plans out like the first question, and then after that, there's a flow conversation. And podcasting is obviously a little bit of a different medium than writing for Esquire or those kind of things, because there has to be a flow of conversation. And I know I was talking to Tim Ferriss about it, and he said, like, maybe his philosophy has changed as well, but if you over-prepare, it feels like the conversation's already been had, and you're probably not as engaged and not as curious.
I don't know, because, like, so for Tim Ferriss, I think I had, for Tools of the Titans, I probably did have 1 or 2 questions on every single page. And he even took a picture. I had his book, I had filled with notes, like just sticking out of each page. And I over-prepared, but also I think then the skill comes in as an interviewer, like, and plus the rapport, like I'm friends with Tim. So you're able to have a conversation and interweave the questions in. You can't really go wrong by over-preparing. But I think now more important is the rapport you establish with the person you're interviewing. So not so much what you're getting out of them in the questions. I think that's going to just fall out of the rapport. It can't hurt to over-prepare because then you'll ask questions that no one else asks. But the rapport is much more important. So I focus much more on that now. And you look at like Joe Rogan's podcast. He has an excellent podcast, and he's just he'll know about the person he's interviewing, but they're talking for 3 hours. They'll just talk about, he'll have on like a comedian or a UFC fighter or whatever, and they'll talk for an hour about UFO conspiracies. Like they'll just talk about anything, but it's a combination of his preparation plus the rapport he has. Or Mark Maron, who has the WTF podcast, he's come out and said he doesn't prepare at all for any of his guests. Like now he knows a lot of them personally, but a lot of it's just, him asking questions, and you have to kind of trust your ability after a while to just be a good interviewer and ask good questions and be curious and listen. Like you were saying earlier, how with Seth Godin, you would often think of questions while he was still talking. I think part of the thing is you get used to is you listen and think of questions at the same time so that it's a more natural flow. I've been let's look at the opposite end. I've been on really bad podcasts where they just, they'll ask a question, I'll give my whole answer, and then there's a pause, and then they'll say, okay, so what is your favorite color? And so you could tell they have just a list in advance, and they'll just stick to that list, and they don't really improvise. You kind of have to improvise and rapport and have a conversation, and that's the best, because podcast is the Wild West a little bit. Like we're just hanging out talking, and it happens to be recorded.
So what are some of the things you've learned over time to build rapport? I mean, AJ kind of talked about being vulnerable and kind of sharing and sometimes flipping the table. Being
vulnerable is great. Talking before the podcast is great. Over-preparing is great because you do want to show that you respect their work. And so I will, read everything, watch every documentary, read every article, look at like obscure stuff on the internet. I'll also try to find common ground really quickly, maybe either before or during the podcast. Like when I had Gary Kasparov on, I mentioned, that I had also worked on the Deep Blue computer that had beaten him in 1997. It was the first time a computer beat the world chess champion. So you find some common ground. I worked on it when it was called Deep Thought, and it was a grad student project. It was my office mate at grad school. It was his project, and IBM had offered me a job to continue working on it when they all moved to IBM.
Wow!
I turned that job down, unfortunately, because I liked a girl in Pittsburgh. Obviously, 25 years later, that did not work out.
It worked out okay.
Relationship.
I think you're doing okay.
So So to build rapport, anything that you use as well, because you also have to build rapport really quickly, especially for the type of guests that you interview, like Scarlett Johansson. I mean, these are people who very limited time get hit up all the time. So how do you stand out in that first 90 seconds?
Well, I think, or when did you fail? I want to get back to his. So when did you fail to build rapport, and how did that feel like?
That is a good question. Well, one strategy I have, which is similar to what you said, is when you compliment them, don't just say, I'm a fan of your work. Compliment something that's really obscure, 100%. Specific.
Yeah, obscure is good.
Like the acknowledgments are like a phrase, the more specific, the better. That's what I always tell people when they're writing cover letters. Everyone loves to have their ass kissed, but make sure it's like in the proper way. And let me think of, one other thing before I get to my failures, which are legion. But there was the opposite of over-preparing was an interesting strategy. They had this at Esquire. They had a cover story on Gerard Butler, who's this actor from 300. And they got this reporter who knew nothing about pop culture, and they didn't tell him who he was interviewing. They just said, show up to this guy's address, ring the doorbell, and he had no idea who. So Gerard Butler opens the door, and the guy's like, hello, who are you? And it was so awkward that it worked.
That's funny.
And the actor was like, are you serious? You don't know who I am? And he was like, yeah, I have no idea who you are.
But that's a format thing again. Like they probably explained the format before they presented the interview in the magazine.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the format worked.
But let me think of failures. What failures do you have? What are your worst interviews?
Well, okay. My worst one ever was Biz Markie, the rapper.
You told me that was tough.
But that's a case where...
And the best thing, I'm just going to interrupt, is you did a follow-up episode, or not a follow-up episode, but you ended up doing an introduction talking about how bad it was going to be.
Right. It was so bad. In fact, he hung up on me. And so what I did was, instead of just presenting the podcast, I did like a meta podcast where I presented the interviewer, but I had a co-host with me, and we would, fast forward and rewind throughout the interview where the co-host and I would discuss why I was so bad at different points. So that was really the podcast.
And what did you learn? What was the...
Well, it's hard because when you have absolutely... imagine two lives as let's say a sequence of events. Usually you can staple some of those events together, like, oh, that happened to me too, or that happened to me too. In almost any life, you could kind of say, oh, we've been through some things that are a little bit similar. But with someone like Biz Markie, we had no area to staple our lives together. And not only that, then I further exacerbated the problem by saying, just a friend. How does it feel like that? Just a friend was the main thing people know you by, and that's a song he did in the 80s. So 35 years ago or whatever, or 25 years or 28 years ago. And he's like, no, I've had many hits since Just a Friend. And I'm like, yeah, but when I go to your website, it just plays Just a Friend as soon as I hit your website. And if you go to anybody in China, they know Just a Friend and none of your other songs. And he's like, no, I had this, I had that, I'm a Nickelodeon. And I said, I know all that. And he basically just hung up. And
that was when he hung up.
Yeah. And so I recently had on, and it hasn't aired yet, but Tim Kennedy. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a big MMA fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And he's in the special forces and stuff. So I started that one off saying that this is unusual because you and I have nothing in common.
Interesting.
And so
go right into it.
And so he was on the defensive. Like, I think you'll find we'll have more in common than you think. And then we actually got along after that.
Nice.
And so I kind of addressed it up front as opposed to, waiting for just disaster to happen.
That is, well, it's interesting because I remember Chuck Klosterman, I don't remember whether he told me or I read it, but that he often, usually reporters wait till the end of an interview to ask the awkward one, like, tell me about when you were accused of sexual harassment. He says that he opens the interview with it just because it throws people off guard and it creates interesting dynamics. I could not do that.
I think people would hate. I'm afraid to be hated. I think people would hate you after that.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't work for me as a strategy, but it is an interesting,
Did you share your failure or did you skip over it?
Well, let me think. I have many failures. I think... Hold on. Let me think of a good one. I would say, well, one of my failures was Bill Maher. Bill Maher, I interviewed a long time ago. I don't know if I'm worried that you'll get the explicit thing from this story.
Oh, no, that's fine. I'll mark it. Don't worry.
Okay. But this was long, and I was about to go meet him, and I said to my friend, what should I ask him? And he's like, ask him what he does before every show. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's just, ask him. So I asked him, and he's like, oh, yeah. Well, this is when he was doing Politically Incorrect a long time ago. And he's
on HBO or ABC?
This was on ABC. And I said, what do you do before every show? And he's like, well, there's a rumor that I masturbate before every show. And I'm like, oh. Well, is it true? And he's like, not all the time, but, sometimes. And then we had a long talk about masturbation, like all the different places he does it, in airplane bathrooms or whatever. And I thought the name of his show is politically incorrect. He never said, like, don't print this. This is embarrassing off the record. So that was like my lead. I just went on and on about his habits. And apparently he did not appreciate that. So,
Well, doesn't he know the rules of on the record?
I know, you would think. And I thought that I was doing him a favor. I thought that I was like, this is like, he'll like it. It's funny. But he was, ABC, which is owned by Disney, does not like their stars going in depth on their masturbatory habits, apparently. And yeah. So
that's not a failure in the interview.
Yeah.
So
right.
tell me about when it was you and the interviewee didn't like each other by mid-interview.
That is a good question. All right. Give me a second.
AJ is just too lovable. He's just too lovable.
It's true. It's
No,
true.
no,
And I like
no.
how, like, with Scarlett Johansson, you had potential for that, but you found a way to make yourself instantly likable by switching seats, basically.
Right, yes.
So you have a natural instinct for that, or maybe you learned it from failure. So when did you learn
All
it?
right, let me think of a good failure here. Well, I would say, I've interviewed people where it was very much the Bismarcky, just monosyllabic answers. I think Sarah Michelle Gellar and we did not bond. We had, this was when she was doing Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and apparently some people on the set did not love her, and someone had put the number 666 on her trailer door, and without her permission, and I asked about that, and that was the end of the interview, basically.
Would she just get up and walk out?
No, but she was like, she shut down, and when you shut down, like I
can't open them up.
I can't get back.
When you talked about Bill Maher, I think it brought up something interesting because you both are incredibly, I guess, transparent about, especially the work you do and like living biblically and like talking about your wife and that relationship and what that looks like. And then you as well, James, are around. I mean, the topics are kind of endless. Do you guys draw the line anywhere as far as things that you won't share, is there any kind of protection of your personal lives, or you just put it all out there?
I don't do any protection of my personal life in the sense that I'll say anything bad about myself, but I'll never say anything bad about someone else. So if I have a bad experience with someone, it's not to me to trash that other person, because how they affected me has everything to do with me and nothing to do with them. No matter how bad the situation is. Also, I don't want to do anything to hurt. Too many times people have hurt my life by saying something bad about me, so I don't ever want to do something to hurt someone else's life. But I will have nothing against hurting my own life by saying something bad about me. I'll say the worst things about myself. Because we all have our darknesses and our things that we're ashamed of, and the best way to deal with them is to just simply come clean about them, and then we don't have to feel that shame or guilt anymore.
It is. It's very liberating, and also that's one of the many reasons I love James's writing.
And vice versa.
Yeah, he's just out there. He is like, I failed at this, I failed at that, which is fantastic. And for me, I agree. When something terrible is happening to me at the time, I always try to remind myself, you know what, this is good material. I'm so it definitely, and it helps psychologically when you're going. Schadenfreude, the idea of like you get joy from other people's pain. I try to practice self-Schadenfreude. Is
that how you pronounce it? I've never pronounced it that way.
I don't know. We're Jewish, not German. You know, Jason? Schadenfreude?
I have no clue either.
But yeah, the idea that when something is happening, horrible is happening to you, you can take a step out and enjoy it as like, oh, look at this shit show. Look at this show. And be aware that this is amusing from an outsider point of view.
That's awesome. Well, I wanted to loop back in regards to your book that you're working on. Do you have a working title yet? Or do you have a title for the book yet?
It is called... Excuse me. That was not like...
And then he died. Then he passed.
You shocked him. His title? What?
It's all relative. It's all about family and how we're all connected. And James and I talked about this. The idea is that everyone in the world is a cousin. And now there are tools on the internet where you can figure out how you're distantly related to people. Like Barack Obama is my 5th great aunt's husband's brother's wife. And what's great about this is like, it's like LinkedIn on steroids, because you can approach people and be, hey, you don't know me, but we are cousins, and here's how. And 25 to 30% of the time, they'll be freaked out. Like, don't ever contact me.
Are you related to Jason?
I haven't checked. I got to check.
We must be on some level, I guess.
Exactly.
But I was getting back to rapport building. That's probably like the ultimate rapport building. I know you did that with, was it George Bush? Or?
Exactly. That's how I got an interview with George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush. He was, I wanted to interview him for my book about family because he's got a fascinating family. And his chief of staff, he still has one, said he's not doing interviews. And I said, well, he is my cousin. And she's like, she laughed. She knew it was ridiculous. And she's like, all right, I'll ask him. And he said, all right, so come on down. So I flew down to Houston and I met with him, and it was fantastic. And we had a beer, and we talked about.
That's such a great way to get an interview.
I was going to say, you should use that to get people. Everybody on your podcast should be like, we're distant cousins, and just try to find a lineage.
I've used AJ's stories in talks. I'll call up AJ because I know I'm related to AJ, so I'll say, how are you related to Donald Trump, or how are you related to Barack Obama? So there's been many talks that I've started off with. I have some news, which may be either, 47% of you might think it's good news, 48% of you might think it's bad news, and then I'll describe how I'm related to Donald Trump, for instance, through AJ. So that's usually good for a laugh or two, and then I'll follow up.
So are we, like, I guess everybody's connected on some level.
Right. Either, we are all blood connected because we all have the same great times 5,000 grandparent. But then we're also related by marriage. So it's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but we're all Kevin Bacon. So it's just a nice way to connect with people. And in I would say 5 years, maybe less, there will be an app on your phone where you can just bump phones and it'll say, here's how you're related. You're 14.
Oh my God, you have to make that app. Do you realize, you use Genie.com, right, for a lot of your stuff? When it first launched, I think it was like 2006, Genie.com was the fastest growing social network ever.
Really?
Within 1 week, they had 100 million users.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's remarkable.
And then, Yammer spun out of Genie. That was their intra-company kind of way to communicate. It spun out to be a B2B company, and then it sold for multi-billions of dollars to Microsoft.
Right. That's always like, isn't that Twitter as well? That was
it was a spin out of Odeo.
Yeah.
Which was a podcast app.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So you're just one idea away from billions.
Yeah, come on, AJ.
On the topic of your book, you did this global family reunion, which I remember when you told me about it. I'm like, that is incredibly, I won't say the word ballsy, but it was a big project.
Yeah.
Was it a bigger undertaking than you thought, kind of going into it?
It was over. First of all, it gave me tremendous respect for you. Because
that was on a different scale. You had how many people there? 5,000?
Yeah, 4,000 in New York, but then like 14,000 worldwide.
Wow.
Broke a world record, right?
I broke a world record. Well, I established world records. That's the secret to world records. It's easier to create one than to break one. But I don't know how you do it all the time, organizing these events, because the amount of detail and the hidden costs, like as my friend put it, when I was organizing this event, he's like, you don't understand. He's like, duct tape. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, you can't believe how much duct tape you're going to need. And so you don't think about all of the things.
Is that metaphorical or actual duct tape?
No, he was saying, you need many rolls of duct tape, and that's going to cost you. What it did. That wasn't the biggest cost on a percentage basis, but it was there.
What was, from the idea to the actual event, how long was that?
That was like a year.
It was a full year, wow.
Yeah.
You've been working on this forever.
Is this your longest project?
Maybe it's like 3.5 years. Yeah. I mean, the other thing, which is I did an interesting strategy, which may be a huge mistake, but I did all this publicity before I even wrote the book. So I was thinking maybe I shouldn't even write the book, just keep doing publicity. But
why do the hard work?
Yeah. But now I've actually written the book.
But now that you've done all these things, the book sort of, not that I don't want to say it wrote itself, but was it easier to write because you had so much research and so many interviews and so much, I mean, you did podcasts on it, conferences on it, magazine articles on it.
True. Yeah, it's definitely, I mean, that's what I like as a writer, to have way too much material and then just pick the best. Yeah, that's my strategy with everything. My first book was about reading the encyclopedia, and I could have written like 14 books on all the crazy stuff that happened and all the weird things I learned.
I didn't know that was your first. The Know-It-All was your first book?
Well, my first real book. I did a lot of like
I wrote one down here in my notes, my extensive notes, something I found on Amazon, which was Fractured Tiny Tales or Fairy Tales.
Fairy Tales.
I can't even read my own writing. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do research anymore because... or at least I'll print it out on my computer next time.
Maybe did you do that on purpose? Like we've been talking about making mistakes on purpose to like establish rapport.
Yeah. Do you feel closer to me now?
Yeah.
Did I screw that up? Okay, perfect. Is there a book specifically? So you have 4 New York Times bestsellers,
right?
With the 5th one coming out soon.
Fingers crossed.
Was there any? Is there a specific book that maybe didn't sell the most, but put you in, I guess, the limelight that really kind of?
Well, one thing I've learned was I wrote this book on living by the rules of the Bible, and for part of it, the Bible says you can't shave the corners of your beard. I didn't know where the corners were, so I just let it grow. And that was one of the best marketing things I've ever done, is have a huge beard, because people are so visual. And to have on the cover this crazy looking thing, already it separates you. And then on the inside, I had just 40 shots of me going from bare cheek to this Sasquatch. And so marketing, I think for books, we underestimate how important visual is.
A Year Living Biblically, would you say is probably your most successful book? It was most successful from a sales perspective?
Yes, from a sales perspective. Okay. Yeah, definitely.
So you have a pilot that just got shot.
CBS bought the rights or optioned the rights, and they shot a sitcom based on The Year of Living Biblically. So it's a guy who is in Mad Men, plays me, not John Hamm, but he's handsome. This guy is handsome. Jay Ferguson is his name, and he plays me as a guy who decides to live his life totally by the Bible. He, grows the beard, stones adulterers, the whole thing. And I went out to the taping, and it was fascinating. It was a live tape in front of the studio. And one lesson I learned from that is bribery. The warm-ups comic literally bribed the audience. He would say, before the show, he's like, "Who wants $20?" And they all go, "Woo!" And then he would throw the 20. "Who wants $50?" It was brilliant.
You should try that.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. That was actually the advice given to me at the first mastermind talks, is give like 5 people in the audience $10, and that's enough to sway the vote for you.
Well, can I tell you one of the worst speaking engagements I ever had was at a convention for evangelical Christians, and the guy who spoke before me is a great guy named Shane Claiborne, who is he's a modern day monk, and he's inspired by Mother Teresa. So he doesn't believe in material goods. So we each got paid like $5,000 to show up, and he said, "I don't need this money." So he had filled these 2 sacks backstage with like $5 bills. And he's like, he takes out the sacks and he starts just throwing money into the crowd. And it was like, woo! And then they're like, okay, and here's A.J. Jacobs. And I'm like, sorry, I bought a jet ski or whatever. I spent it on myself. You're not getting any money from me. So like, try to follow that. Some guy giving away free money. And then they're like, oh, now here's a
Well,
guy.
after hearing that story and after hearing you doing your move into stand-up comedy, I'm definitely have a little more courage to potentially try it in the next year. I'll get
We're
Candace.
going to hold you to that annual report.
I will report exactly. Do my annual report. That'll be.
We'll meet here a year from now.
Great idea.
I have probably a couple things, but we'll wrap up relatively soon. I got hands going on behind. What do they call that studio window? I feel like I'm getting interrogated by the FBI. It's a what?
It's called a window.
Oh, it's just called a window. Genius. All right, amateur hour.
It's the window.
But James, I want to know, because I think you are absolutely brilliant when it comes to, again, sucking people in with your writing. But in order to suck people in with your writing, you need to have great titles. I hate to distill it down to is there a framework you use for titles of your articles and those kind of things? I mean, all your Facebook posts are like I thought I was gonna die ... or those kind of things. Yeah, is there anything you've learned over the years as far as how to capture people's attention right out of the gate like you do?
I think, with any kind of communication now, you're up against so much competition. You're up against Donald Trump's tweets. So people have a choice to read Jason's blog post or Donald Trump's latest tweets. And so often
there's a
they'll
clear
choose-
winner in that one.
But there's that kind of competition now in the world. So you kind of have to engage people in the story right from the title. So this title has to be almost part of the story. And that's the only thing I can think of, is I try to think of, and the story has to be, an extreme story. Not an extreme on purpose. It has to be a real event that happened, but your title is part of your story.
And for me, I find that clarity, it used to be you could be clever in the title and have puns or whatever. But now, the best titles for me are the ones that just say what it is. That's
a really good point.
The Year of Living Biblically. You know exactly what you're getting. You're getting a guy living by the Bible for a year. So I'm actually a little nervous because this new book is it's not clear what the exact theme is from the title. It's all relative. Might be too clever.
I think, what's your subtitle?
Well, the subtitle is Adventures Up and Down the Family Tree. I don't remember, something like that. We'll see.
Well, you've done
see
3
how it
years
works.
of PR, so you
That's
have
the
that
hope.
on your side.
Exactly.
So let me ask you both: if we were to meet in this studio a year from now, let's say we're doing our yearly check-in with a bottle of champagne, what achievements on your side are we celebrating, and what achievement on your side are we celebrating?
James, you go.
I think I'm dead. I have an 18-year-old. She's almost done being an adult. That's my job, is to push these kids out to being an adult. And then what else do I have to do? It's pretty hard to live. I'm not saying this in a depressing way. It's just...
You're done.
Yeah, I'm done. What else do I have to do? Do I really have to do more work on this planet? It's pretty hard.
You've given... You know what?
Top that one,
I
AJ.
want to have a super successful podcast with James Altucher on our every week, every month we do a weird experiment. And
we're doing that. We're
podcast?
gonna do a mini series within my podcast. Start it off that way and challenge each other to challenges.
And actually, this one of our first ones is the idea that touch is an underrated stress reliever and just an underrated way to communicate. So if you wouldn't mind, just, there you go.
Coming in? You got to come in.
All right.
Holding hands.
Yeah, we're gonna
We
hold
are,
hands.
for those who cannot see,
This
which
is-
is most people.
And the
we
challenge
are.
has been to complete strangers on the
that
whole.
is hard.
It's hard.
I'm going to do it as soon as I turn in my book, which is in 3 days.
I've done it now 3 times.
You have? Well,
Yeah.
don't tell me because I want to hear about it.
It's hard.
I don't know who's going to let go first. Is it?
I'm never letting go. This is it.
All right, gentlemen.
He
there's-
wants to let go. I can
I am
feel his
not-
hands just
All right.
trying.
You feel the quiver. Okay, 1, 2, 3, boom.
All right.
Perfect. I have never ended a podcast like that, and that is the first. That's incredible, guys. Really, really appreciate it. Incredibly, grateful for both of you. Again, the support of Mastermind Talks early on, and the support over the years. It's been amazing. So,
Well, I love to see your success. It's
And
fantastic.
what I have to say also, the community has been immense because look, I met AJ there.
True.
Met so many people there. last year when I went, I was going through kind of a personal crisis, and it was great to go out to Ojai and just, it was like a detox to just, like you say, a reunion with old friends and just go there. So it was a great talk. I mean, a great event.
You're always, all of you are welcome back, your family. So thanks again, and we'll call it a day.
Thank you, Jason.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Feel free to reach out to James at James Altucher on Twitter, or AJ at AJ Jacobs on Twitter as well. Let them know your thoughts, show them some love. And as always, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Jason Gaynard, or email me directly at J, so the letter J, at communitymade.com with your thoughts. For show notes and resources mentioned in this episode, visit the Community Made group. If you're not a member, it is free. Simply go to communitymade.com to get access. Also, a quick shout out to our reviewer of the week, Jamie Swanson. Jamie said, "This is my new favorite podcast." Thank you. Jason's authenticity and wisdom, along with the incredible production quality, makes an incredible production quality. I got to thank Chad. Chad is a ninja when it comes to production, so thank you, Chad. Makes this podcast incredible. I was going to binge listen on a trip, but after listening to the second episode of Why Scaling is Stupid, I actually had to turn it off and just sit and think for a while. It's great. I've already recommended it to lots of people, and definitely will continue to listen as more episodes are released. Bring on season 2. I'm already anxiously awaiting for it. I'm working on season 2. I'm working on it. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a big season, but it's going to be great. Again, if you've enjoyed the podcast, I would be forever grateful if you got the word out by sharing it with a friend, rating it on iTunes, or leaving a review on Facebook. I appreciate your love and support. You know I do. And I look forward to releasing season 2 again in the coming weeks. I'm Jason Gaynard, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Community Made Podcast.